Woo, here it is, guys. Probably the most requested video of the entire ArtStation Challenge series. Today, we're talking lighting and fog in Unreal. Welcome back to Polygon Academy. Tim here as always, and today we're diving into one of the most important aspects of environment creation in games. Lighting is often left to the last minute by some people on their own personal projects, and that can be a huge mistake. So I'm trying to bust this video out for you guys. There's a couple days left in the challenge, and I know some of you are struggling with your lighting, and hopefully this can give you some quick tips that can rapidly improve your scene without having to go and improve a bunch of assets. You can hopefully increase the visual quality by doing a quick lighting and fog pass that looks great and really shows off all the art that you've created. So to me, lighting and fog, they're pretty much the glue that sticks everything together when it comes to the final visual presentation of what's on screen in a video game. It helps the characters blend into the environments properly. It can provide mood and atmosphere. And most importantly, it is usually used to guide the player through the world as they explore over the course of the game. Lighting can make not so great art look pretty great, and because it doesn't matter if your wireframe is super amazing, if the overall lighting and visual presentation kind of suck, you can only push that final image so far. So by investing a bunch of time in the lighting, color grading, and fog pass, you can really get the most bang for your buck in terms of visual return on investment. And so it's something to take pretty seriously, and I know a lot of people aren't super comfortable with it, so hopefully with some of these tips, you can attack your lighting pass with a lot more confidence and end up with something that you're really happy with in terms of the final visual on the screen. We're also going to be going over a couple technical and artistic mistakes that a lot of people make when they first start doing lighting in Unreal. And hopefully with a few of these tips, you can decrease your iteration time, and it'll make your lighting pass a lot smoother and easier for your next project or your current scene. This book right here, Color and Light by James Gurney, is a phenomenal resource. It's all about painting, but all of those lessons in the book when it comes to color theory, how light works that he talks about, are essential when it comes to learning how to be a really good lighting artist. And I know this is on almost every lighting artist shelf, every concept artist shelf probably. I can't recommend it enough, so go check it out. I'll leave a link below. It's a really, really good resource. So let's hop over to the computer, and we're gonna reverse engineer the current lighting setup I have in my scene for the challenge. So if we wanna break down this lighting, the very first thing I always start with is the skylight, and a big mistake that a lot of people who are kind of unfamiliar with lighting is they don't put enough emphasis on their skylight or ambient and fill lighting, and they'll throw in a sunlight and have really dark shadows and be like, oh, okay, I guess that's how the sun works. It's a really bright light, but they forget the sky is actually one of the biggest fill light in the world. And a lot of overcast days, you might not even use, or for a lot of overcast lighting scenarios, you might not even really use a directional light for the sun. Maybe at a super low intensity just to get a little bit of shadows. But in situations where it's overcast or really diffused lighting, you're gonna use mostly your skylight to add a lot of fill and let the ambient occlusion and GI kind of add the shape and the form to the scene. So if I go to my basic lighting setup, I'll disable all the little spotlights that I've placed in the scene to like fake sunlight coming through the canopy. Here you can see I have a lighting folder with all these little spotlights, so I can actually just toggle them. Bang, all that goes off, and that's right now what you're looking at is literally the skylight and a directional light. So if we fly through the scene here, you can see there's still some sun coming through the canopy, which is great. And it gave me an initial idea of how the lighting was going to be. And I used my skylight to kind of fill in all those dark places with a bit of ambient light, and that way you don't have super black shadows. That would be something I would try and avoid, even in nighttime scenes and stuff like that. You never want your shadows to be 100% black most of the time, because especially depending on the TV that people are using, it can make things really unreadable and hard to see the overall environment. It's cool to have areas of darkness and shadow. Not everything has to be really brightly lit and shown, and you don't have to hey, look at every little piece of art that I've made. It's great to have areas of contrast, of light and shadow. So yeah, just use your sun and your skylight to get that initial base down. And actually what I'll do is I'll also hide all the fog sheets that I've placed, because I've been using some of the BP fog sheets from some of the starter content. That's something an effects artist would make usually, and I don't have the time to learn how to fully do that. And lighting artists, they're usually just placing effects and fog and stuff like that the effects artists make for them anyways. So if I hide that, you'll see that it's quite a drastic difference on and off. And these are all hand-placed like fog cards that fade out as the camera or the player gets close to them. So if I hide it, now what you're seeing is literally just the volumetric fog in Unreal. If I press Alt-F, that's the hotkey to toggle the fog on and off. So it's for the first 3,000 units, I'm using the volumetric fog, and then after that it transitions to the standard distance fog, just to keep things, a little bit cheaper and not to completely kill my frame rate by just going volumetric fog everywhere. And because it's probably one of the most expensive things you can add to your scene. So yeah, you can see with the basic skylight and directional light, it does look pretty decent, but it kind of looks a bit flat. There's no areas where your eyes can focus. Right here where the player would be going, it's like the story gate here doesn't have any highlights or anything on it. So if we basically turn on all the spotlights that I've placed in the scene, you can see some areas of focus kind of come into place that kind of lead your eye around the environment. And I used temperature on these lights, so I set it to, I think, 5800 on the temperature, which is kind of like a sunlight, warmish kind of color to the light, instead of just using colors and guessing what I think the sunlight is. If you go and check online, most people say that the sun is about 5600 Kelvin. So I set it to be a little bit cooler than that because I want the overall scene to be a bit more depressing and kind of like feel not as like warm and sunny. But because they're all the same temperature and same color, and I set my directional to that as well, I know it'll all evenly match up. So it allows me to kind of fake these sun hits without having to have, oh, is this one yellow, is this one blue? And that's actually a big mistake that a lot of beginner lighters do, is they'll just randomly pick a bunch of colors, and it starts to look a bit like Christmas, especially for a scene like this where it's initially set out to be more of a monochromatic color palette with a bit of an accent color in the orange. So I want to keep everything fairly consistent, and with my lighting, I'm mainly focusing on showcasing the forms and leading the player's eye through the environment. So it's totally cool to add these little fake spots to accent form. Lighters do it all the time, and a lot of people, they'll throw in their directional and their skylight and be like, well, I guess that's it. That's how lighting works in real life. But really, the job of a lighting artist is to emphasize the forms and the shapes in the environment, as well as give gameplay lighting to help that. So you do end up faking quite a bit, and if you rely on just a skylight and a sunlight, chances are it's not going to have the overall oomph or impact that you could get by hand placing a few different lights throughout the environment. So if I turn on all my lights, you can see them here. I have a spotlight here that gives a bit of a highlight to these forms here. This one as well, if I toggle it on and off, kind of gives some shape to these statues or lanterns. If it's off, you kind of see that they're kind of flat, and then this actually gives a bit of highlights and some actual good shape to the form. And then I have a spotlight here. It kind of just helps guide the eye to that final torii gate and that overall place where the player would be running. So basically what I did is, for this competition, I set up kind of 3 camera shots that I knew would be kind of my final compositions, and I opened up a secondary window and had that viewport be that camera and basically lit to those shots. So what I can do is I can go to my first camera actor. This is kind of like one of my first initial shots. And then I literally just place lights so this shot looks good, and I wasn't too worried about if, when you're running around the environment, if it looks perfect, because I know I'm not gonna really showcase that as my final screens. It still works pretty good. And that's kind of the balance between cinematic and gameplay lighting. For a lot of cinematics, a lot of fake lights are placed, so to highlight characters, give them rim lights, fill lights for their faces and stuff like that. So I'm taking a bit of that approach from my overall scene final presentation screenshots, but I do want it to look pretty good when you're running around, so there's not some weird spotlight casting on the player that is just randomly out of nowhere. And I think it feels pretty natural when you run through the environment so far. Yeah, so basically if I go here and go through my lights, you'll see I have a spotlight here placed. This one is pretty big. for player navigation. Without it, it's kind of, oh, you can kind of get the impression, yeah, I probably should go there. But when you turn that on, it's bang. There's like a big beam of light coming through. And then if I add on the fog, you know, a beam of light coming through that kind of justifies that light hit. And then all this fog in the background silhouetting the trees and just adding some depth to the environment and kind of hiding the fact that there's not a lot of stuff back there. So using fog is a great way to add depth to your scene, and never be afraid to go a bit heavier with it. If you look at a lot of games, they really use fog to pop silhouettes, and stuff off in the distance is kind of hidden, and it all kind of just glues everything together. So really don't be afraid to use fog, even if you feel like it's hiding things. Chances are it's not as important that they see the grain on the bark in that tree way off in the distance, rather than just get the feeling and the mood, which is a lot more important than being like, oh, look at my normal map, it's so cool. Yeah, so by using fog, you can kind of hide and push things, and it's a great way to also help visually guide the player's eye. So you can see here's pretty much the brightest spot in the overall environment, and I would know directly as I'm running through the environment to go there. So same thing, like I said, for this shot, I use these spotlights to highlight these kind of forms here. And then also still one of the brightest spots is the house and the gate in the background. So your eye directly goes there, and I have all these leading lines with these bricks and stuff like that, kind of pushing your eye right to that central focal point. Here's another shot. Basically, I just use these cameras and I grab my lights, and I literally would just move them without moving this camera, just to get what I would actually want the light to look like. I want to do that. I think there's one up there. So by using two viewports, you can have that fixed camera perspective and light directly to that. If I eject, you can see the spotlight here just gives a bit of a highlight to the tree and these rocks. So it's super, super subtle. If I turn it on and off, it just adds some form to this tree just by having some light roll off the trunk, and also, gives a little bit of highlights to these rocks here. And I did that a lot. If I go back to the first shot, all these highlights here on these trees are actually hand-placed spotlights. Check from this camera. Where are they? Yeah, so they're hidden up here, tucked away, and they're all at kind of the same angle as my directional. So even though it's faked, it kind of all lines up and works because the light's not coming from a random direction. It's all coming from this same angle as my directional light. So even though it's faked, it kind of all blends together. And you're not looking up at the canopy being like, is that a light precisely coming down through those branches? It's like, okay, all the light's coming from the same direction. And when you're running around, it kind of fills it into your mind and just feels a bit natural. So you can see if I go to the shot here, I turn that one on and off, it becomes a bit flatter without it. So on, off, maybe a little bright, I'll probably tone it down a bit. And it gives you a bit more control than just relying on, angling your directional light and hoping for the best. Because chances are it's not going to look great everywhere, just because it's really complicated. You have this big dense canopy. You can spend time pushing and pulling your trees around to kind of get what you want. But I already really like the composition, and even though there wasn't any highlights, so I just went in and added some manually, just by adding these little cheap spotlights. All these are stationary lights, so I'm baking my skylight and my sun's, basically all the bounce light and the GI. So I base that into light maps, and the shadows for the sunlight are real-time in a radius around the player. And then those real-time shadows die off in the distance, so you're not destroying your frame rate, and it's not super expensive. For some of my lights, like this one, if I go to the details panel, you can see it's not actually casting shadows. Shadow casting lights are pretty expensive in Unreal. A shadow casting light is 20 times more expensive than a non-shadow casting one. But if I move it around, you can see that it does look like it's kind of casting shadows. And that's because I'm using a light function. If I scroll down. And what a light function is, it's basically like a mask for the light. And what I did is I created this one from a texture in Photoshop. If I open it up, see, I created this texture in Photoshop. And I literally just Googled, branches looking up at the sky, just because it doesn't have to be super accurate. I just wanted this kind of noisy tree pattern that I could project onto the ground. And that's literally what this is doing. And so I made it, a circular thing, so I would be projecting it onto the ground as a spotlight. And then you just create a material. It's super simple. I have some things where I can increase the contrast and the power of it. But in here, you just switch your material to light function, plug it into the emissive, save your material out, and then what you do in your light is where it says light function, you scroll down from all the other details. Scroll down to light function, plug it in, and bang, there we go. We have these fake little shadows. They're not moving, and some of the shadows from the trees are actually moving from the directional. So it's not a huge deal, but what I could do is I could plug the same like wind values that I have on my branches that are kind of causing the alphas to move around into the actual light function, and that way the texture would kind of shift around a bit. That's a real fine-tuned detail, because when you're running through the environment, you're not really noticing of like, is every little tiny shadow moving? So it's just a great way to fake things. You can fake it by having, spinning fans or, light fixtures that project a kind of like a grid over the environment, so you don't have to have really expensive shadow casting lights. You can have like a chain link fence pattern and project that across an environment and fake things like that to save on performance, especially on console. It's a great way to have complex shadows without having a ton of shadow casting and lights that are really expensive that kill your frame rate on consoles. So, little tip there. This area was just kind of flat, and because it's on the main gameplay path, I would want it to actually, have a bit of a pool of light intermittently throughout the gameplay path, because that helps guide the player. Even though it's pretty obvious you're going up a staircase, but it's just something you can do to psychologically guide them through the environment. So yeah, if I toggle it on and off, you'll see it just feels kind of flat. Everything's all in shadow here. So by having this bit of highlights, it gives this wall here on the left a bit of form, gives these rocks some shape and some interesting highlights on them too. And as you can see, these fog sheets here, it's just grabbed. This one is grabbed from I think the particle effects in the Unreal Starter content, and the God rays are pulled from the, let me take a look here. It is pulled from the Blueprints one. There's a bunch of God rays that you can just migrate into your project, and then this is the particle effects one. So grab those things, and if you're not an effects artist, don't waste a ton of time trying to make effects, because you'll waste a ton of time and it probably won't look half as good as what they have already set up. So I just shamelessly grabbed them, and I know a lot of other more experienced artists will do the same thing. They'll grab drips or sparks and stuff like that, put them in the scene to add some extra life, because they're not an effects artist, so why would they spend time creating that stuff if you're an environment artist? And the nice thing about these is you can see it fades out as the camera gets close, which is good, because then you don't have this weird line cutting through the camera as you run through it. And they also do have a bit of like panning noise on them, so it feels like there's actual atmosphere rather than just relying on the basic Unreal fog, which is by default kind of static and flat and just adds depth to the scene, but it doesn't really add any movement, so it doesn't feel like there's actually anything going on in like the atmosphere. So if I come here, this ground fog, if you press T, it toggles selecting transparency. So this ground fog is literally that exact plane. I just rotated it. It's a little cheap hack. It would be nice to get some actual volumetric particles, but I don't have time to do that. And time's tight, and I'm getting this to look the way that I want it to by just using whatever tools are at my disposal. So, if I can pull this up and down, you can see like there's a bit of a panning thing. If I really speed it up, you can see like it's just a panning clouds texture, and it adds some movement to the scene. And you can adjust the brightness. So you want it super like graveyard style, or the opacity. You can bring that up and down, and you can change the distance from which it fades from the camera. And then these God rays here, they have a bit of turn on animated or not, so that's non-animated. If I turn on animated, you can see they kind of fade in and out here and there. Same thing, they got a fade distance. So the higher this is, the further away it starts to fade out. If I hide all these fog sheets, I still have some fog in my scene, but it's really kind of pushed to the background, because if I take the height fog and just ramp up the overall density, where is it? Exponential height fog. Say the like 1, it just washes everything out and kind of dims it out, which isn't, it can be good if you want that effect, but for me, I like to push it back a bit and have some extra depth in my scene, and then add extra fog on top of that to really have a lot more control over it. If you see, if I can toggle the volumetric fog on and off, this is just the default like distance fog, and then the volumetric takes the skylight and the sunlight into account, and you can actually change the amount that these things are scattering on the volumetric scattering for each light. So if I select my sunlight here, I have the volumetric down here. You can see it's set to like 1.5. I don't want a ton of like crazy light scattering, because it makes everything, like I said, washed out. So if I crank this up to, you know, like, you can really punch your God rays, but I don't think that looks too good, and that's I think a kind of an amateur thing to do, is like crank up the God rays because it's a fancy effect, and it doesn't look that great. Just because you have it doesn't mean you should crank it. So I try and keep it really subtle. For my skylight, I think I have it at like 0.3. If I crank this up, it really starts to wash everything out. So, you know, you can get that really like heavy fog look, which could be cool if you're going for that effect. But it pushes everything, you know, it flattens your image a little bit too much. So I'd rather have it subtly fog out in the background and have some subtle God rays from the sun, and then hand place a lot of my actual stuff with these cheaper fog sheets and stuff like that, that just allows me to control the fog in the scene a lot more. So I can have it foggier off to the sides of the image and maybe some of this cool ground fog, but it's not just fog everywhere that flattens everything out. So because I'm baking my lighting, basically if I go to my world settings, you can see that my static lighting scale, I set it down to 0.2, and this will get you a lot more accurate lighting results. It'll get rid of a lot of like blotchiness or seams, but it also dramatically increases your bake times. So I would, you know, you can set that to a lower number and your results will probably look a lot better. But if you're still building your scene and iterating on your environment, I wouldn't worry about that. But because now I'm doing like a final lighting pass, I would decrease that number and just get a lot nicer, cleaner bakes. So yeah, another thing that people kind of tend to do is their light map sizes are usually way too high, which drastically increases your bake times and doesn't actually give you that much better results unless you're going 100% static baked lighting and you need like really crisp shadows in your light maps. For something like mobile or something like that, you would probably increase your light map size. But because in a scene like this, all of my shadows are, especially from the sun, are dynamic in that radius around the player. You don't really need super intense sizes on your light maps, because basically all you're doing is in those light maps is baking these subtle color transitions from the bounce light, whereas the actual direct light is all real time. So if I go into optimization view modes, light map density, you can see everything is super low res. Each one of these squares is a pixel. And like most of my objects, I have the light map set to maybe like 16 or 32 or maybe 64 for some of the bigger objects. Like the houses where the walls are white, so you actually notice a bit more splotchiness. But a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll take like a prop like this, like the Torii Gate, and they'll set the light map size to something like 256 or 512. And then they'll take, you know, the wall of the house and set that to like a 1024 light map because they think, oh, I need all this crazy detail in my light maps. And that will skyrocket your bake times, and it won't actually increase your results nearly as much as you would think. So yeah, as you can see, like these shadows are from the directional light. They're not actually baked, so you can see them moving and stuff like that. but what is being baked is the actual bounce light from the sun. So when the sun comes through and say hits this wall, like this wall here, the sunlight would come through, those photons would hit that wall, and they would bounce and scatter around the environment. And that's why you don't actually ever get really 100% black shadows, because light is always scattered and diffused throughout the atmosphere, and it'll hit a wall and it'll bounce off, and that's why you get, say, probably some of this orange scattering through the environment, because those light photons pick up that color and scatter it around, and that's GI, or global illumination. So some people might think, oh, the sun's hitting this tree, but that means there should be a big shadow right across here, and this should all be black. And that's a big misconception a lot of people have when they first start lighting. And so that's why I say try and avoid those 100% razor sharp or black shadows, because a lot of times shadows are really soft, especially on overcast or moody, like lighting scenarios like this, because the light's just super diffused. It's filtering through the canopy, it's bouncing around inside the trees, and then when it finally reaches the ground, it's not really like a super razor sharp hard cut shadow. If you look at the lighting mood boards, you can see it's like more of like just subtle pools. Even though there's all these leaves and stuff up here, you're not really seeing like leaf silhouettes in the overall shadows. And that's just because the light is being so scattered about inside the fog, the atmosphere, the canopy. By the time it gets to the ground, it's really just like this nice, soft, subtle, diffused kind of look. Here you can see, yeah, there's a bit more harsh highlights, but you're still not getting like leaf projections on these images. So yeah, and back to the main concept, really like soft, subtle, diffused light coming through the canopy and hitting the ground. It's actually a bit darker than my scene. So I'll probably go back and tweak it to be a little bit more in line with the concept. I don't want to go too overcast because it'll start to look a bit flat. That's why I added those spotlights, is to show a bit more of the forms, add some highlights and sense of interest here and there. But for moody stuff like this, it's awesome to have a really soft, diffused look to your lighting. And finally, for a shot like this, I use the cinematic cameras to get that nice depth of field going on. And I actually place them in a way that some of these statues, like these things in here and the tree, actually kind of helps frame the image and get blurred out. And that's a nice effect to add some depth to your scene too, is to use things to frame things and then either blur them out or have a nice rack focus. Maybe if I make a video, I'll have this part, say, on the stairs and the statues be in focus, and then I'll change the focal distance. So you get that nice kind of rack focus that you get in movies where they'll have like fade from one character to another during a conversation. It's really subtle usually, and now that I've mentioned it, you'll probably see it a lot more. But it's a nice way to add depth to scenes and just quickly change your focus in the overall composition. And it's really cool. It's really easy with Unreal cinematic cameras. So go in there, try it out, change the aperture to something really low, like 2 or 1.8, and then start playing around with the focal distance, and you should get some nice depth of field that could add some extra depth to your scene and help just make things pop. Because not everything has to always be in focus. And like I said, I don't really care if people see every little tiny normal map detail in this statue here. I'm more concerned with showing the shape of it. So it's got this bit of a spotlight casting a highlight here and there, and then part of it's in shadow. And I don't really care if people see those details, because the overall shape and form of the scene is what matters more than showcasing every little tiny detail. And you can really use lighting to do that. So if I go into the actual fog sheets, you can see that I've used these to actually silhouette a lot of objects too. So I pushed it back behind these rocks. So now the rocks kind of pop forward into the foreground, rather than if I had just added a fog plane here and then it really flattens things out. So yeah, if I hide this, you can see without it, it's kind of flat too. Like these values and these values look very similar, and you lose that sense of depth in the scene if I unhide it. Now, yeah, you don't see this as much, but it adds that extra just sense of depth to the foreground and midground that's really essential on helping not only navigate environments, but make it feel like an actual 3D space. One final tip that I like to do sometimes is if I go into my post-process volume here, it's in my post-process volume. If I go to the color grading tab here, what I can do for the global is you can go to saturation and just bring this down to 0. That makes your image black and white. And it's actually really good to look at all your images in black and white. Either take a screenshot, put it in Photoshop, and you know, play around with the values there, because it allows you to look at straight just like a value and not have colors or color contrast get in the way of that. And that way you can clearly look and see where the brightest areas of your scene are, because sometimes you might be trying to, you know, draw the player's eye somewhere, but maybe you have a different colored light and you're like, you think that might work. But when you look at things in black and white, it really gives you a clear cut image of, oh, where's the brightest image of the scene, where's the focal point, and how are the silhouettes and things like that reading. So by making this black and white, you can see right here, and these stairs and these stairs here are kind of some of the brightest elements of the scene. Right here is starting to get a bit bright, so I'll probably tone that down, just because it is starting to distract from here. But you can actually, you know, just light in this view mode. Grab this, and let's say that, grab this spotlight and increase it. And you can actually just light in black and white. That's really good when you're doing your first pass too, because that way you can actually just see things in terms of their forms. So that's probably a bit too bright, but you can see it really starts to pop things out. So if things aren't feeling right, maybe switch your scene to completely desaturated post-process volume and go in and just play around with the shapes with things by using lights to highlight the forms. And then probably when you go back into color mode, it'll look a lot better too, because you're literally focusing on form through the value of things. When lighting scenes for game environments, it's super important to keep the overall gameplay and player path in mind. And since the beginning of this challenge, I said I wanted to treat this like an actual game environment and not just compose a pretty picture. And that way, hopefully I can give you guys a few, you know, I was able to give you guys a few more tips that are relevant when creating portfolio pieces that you could use to get jobs at a game studio. So it adds a bit of extra work, treating everything like a full 3D environment that you can explore. And but I think it's pretty cool exercise, and I'm really having a lot of fun with it. The timeline's coming up, so I'm gonna get back to work and smash out this you know, final lighting and polish phase. Next time we see each other, the scene should be done, and I'm gonna do a bit of a post-mortem exercise where I'll kind of break down what went right, what went wrong, and tips and advice I would give myself and you guys if I was starting this over from scratch now that I have the benefit of some hindsight. So it should be a pretty fun little you know, video and exercise, and I'm really excited to finish this off and see all the awesome artwork that came out over the course of the challenge. I've been dipping into work in progress threads that you guys have been doing, and it's super, super cool. There's a lot of strong contenders, so I'm gonna invest that last day and a half and try and rock this out to the best quality as possible, and hopefully have something that I can be really proud of at the end of the challenge. All right, guys. So hopefully with those few tips and tricks for lighting and fog in Unreal, you can attack your next lighting pass with a bit more confidence and end up with that beautiful, polished, final image that you initially imagined when you first started out on your project. I also want to give a huge shout out to a series on YouTube called the Unreal Lighting Academy. It's being done by a technical lighting artist at DICE, so someone who really knows their stuff. And it's a really hardcore, in-depth tutorial series where he relights people's scenes and gives a ton of technical information. They're really long-form videos, and they're just packed with little tiny bits of knowledge. I know they really helped me, and I bet you will learn a ton if you go check them out. I'll leave a link below. Go give him some love because his series is awesome. If you enjoyed this video or you learned something, please leave a comment below. It really helps the channel grow, and I really appreciate it. If you're not subscribed, smash that button because I got a ton more game industry and art content coming out soon. Now that the ArtStation challenge is wrapping up in just a couple days, I'll have a bit more free time to make more videos on a weekly basis, and I'm really excited and looking forward to that. So as always, see you in the next video.